HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Fantasy Expert by Ron Shandler. Read by B.J. Harrison. Forward. I met Ron Shandler across a draft table at USA Today Baseball Weekly's League of Alternative Baseball Reality, or LABR, Labor, fantasy baseball auction in St. Petersburg, Florida, in 1996. I was covering spring training from a fantasy angle for ESPN, and it was a great honor to have been invited by the league's organizer and columnist, John Hunt. The experts were lined up at a table, facing a gallery of mostly empty seats, as we put together our teams. I knew most of the participants only by what they'd published, and some not at all. I got to hang out with Ron, Steve Moyer, Larry Labadini, and many others. I was writing for the biggest sports news outlet in the world, but so many fantasy baseball smarts sitting at the same table was intimidating. The next year, Labor held its auction at the ESPN Sports Zone on a Disney property outside of Orlando. The experts spent a lot of time at that event grousing about the crowded and loud facility. Mutual grievance led to increasing familiarity and developing friendships. Those friendships led me to join Ron in the Tout Wars Rebellion the next spring, quitting Labor and launching our alternative and expert-run league at a huge sports bar in New York's Times Square. The atmosphere there was electric, a coming-out party onto the biggest stage ever. I was reminded of these events reading this book about Ron's breezy and sometimes barbed journey through the first 25 years of fantasy baseball history. Ron's sharp eye recounts his efforts to start a fantasy baseball information and publishing company from a kitchen table in New Hampshire. That quest thrust him into the arms of the growing fantasy baseball business, and the, mostly, lone wolves inventing it, like Ron, as they went along. These are stories of the game's founders, and tales of innovation and failure. Along the way, we meet many of the personalities who were crucial to the culture that has developed around fantasy baseball. Although Ron abhors the term, fantasy expert is the story of fantasy experts. Some, like Bill James and Dan Okrent, are immortals, who would certainly resist the moniker, but whose innovations were essential to the game's existence. We also hear about Glenn Wagoner, the game's first great chronicler, Alex Patton, the first to publish the game's crucial math, and many others. Ron knew them all, either in person or through their writing, and regales us with the stories of those who found themselves a little bit crazed, maybe a lot obsessed, and who committed themselves to figuring out how to play the fantasy game and sometimes win. I consider myself lucky to be counted in their numbers. Still, all is not always nice in the world of fantasy expert. Ron skewers the Johns, Hunt, and Benson for the times they ignored the interests of the fantasy baseball community. There is no greater sin to Ron than that betrayal, but that doesn't mean there isn't also room for him to give them credit when they contributed, which he does. A handful of years later, in the early aughts, Ron invited me into the XFL, and I found myself increasingly involved in what we somewhat facetiously call the fantasy industry. I spent many Novembers attending Shandler Palooza in Arizona, and many March Tout weekends in New York City. I spent 22 years as the editor of the Fantasy Baseball Guide Professional Edition, connecting me with so many talented fantasy writers. After joining the Tout Wars Board of Directors in 2011, I found myself fully a part of the vibrant fantasy baseball community that, it became increasingly clear, Ron had created. A robust mix of cooperating competitors sharing information as freely as beers at the sadly missed Foley's NYC. The first truism of fantasy baseball culture is, no one wants to hear about your fantasy team. Ron violates that rule from time to time, but you won't mind it, because he's always either making some larger point, showcasing the talents of others, teaching the wonders of marketing, damning the closed-mindedness of the St. Louis Cardinals, or inventing the doomed term fanalytics to describe what he does professionally, to name just a few of the narrative paths he follows. For Ron, there is always the next topic, the next project, the next people to ally with, to promote, and to enjoy while putting together the next baseball forecaster, the next keynote, or the next challenge to one orthodoxy or another. In the end, that enjoyment is the major theme that holds Fantasy Expert together. Ron can get prickly. Things don't always go as well as he hopes, but he doesn't shy away from the problems. In his history of fantasy baseball, struggle becomes just another excuse for finding good people to work with and kick back with. Reading his book is as much fun as being there back then, and I can tell you that being there was a blast. It still is. Peter Kreutzer. Introduction. Testimony. Hello, my name is Ron, and I am a rotoholic. This problem has been going on for a very long time, and has come to define my life. I am here to warn you that the dangers of excess can happen to anyone. I'm here to detail the cruel realities of all the years of self-abuse and perhaps encourage you to take an honest look in the mirror. I've tried to stop, many times. People have said I need to take responsibility for my actions. They continue to tell me, Ron, it's only a game. It's only a game. A game? That's not remotely true. Rotisserie baseball is way bigger than just a game. It's far more than any human being can control. Still, even if I take some responsibility, I also had enablers. Other people helped create this monster. It wasn't just me. I think it started with a man named Bill James. Back in the 1980s, I discovered his book called The Bill James Baseball Abstract. I couldn't resist the allure of statistics. There were all these numbers that I had grown up with, but then there were all these new numbers. They were bright and sparkling and painted baseball players with wonderfully vibrant colors. I'd never seen anything like it before, and I was captivated. But Bill James didn't stop writing at just one book. No, he had to write his book year after year after year, feeding me and feeding me and feeding me. Each spring I'd camp out in front of B. Dalton, waiting for the new edition to come out. They'd tell me, sorry, sir, it hasn't come in yet. But I'd be back again the next morning with my large coffee and apple fritter. And the next morning. And the next. And when that year's book arrived, oh, that moment when I could wrap my arms around the blue cover or the red cover or yellow or green, seeing that new cover was the first buzz. And then I'd open it, slowly, smell the fresh ink, feel the soft pages between my fingers, and I was saved for another year. Bill James tried to break me in 1989 when his book stopped, but it was okay. I had already been spending time with a new crush. His name was Glenn Wagner. He wrote a book about a game called Rotisserie League Baseball, invented by someone named Dan Okrent. This little green book was about a game within a game, a numbers game. How could I resist? Rotisserie. Ah, it just rolled off my lips like hot, greasy chicken. I think that's when I started hoarding box scores. I'd get up at the break of dawn to make sure I bought that very first copy of USA Today out of the machine. I remember that machine at the Mobil station on Route 3. I had to be the first person to get his hands on the red section with all those numbers. And then, years went by, and I couldn't get enough of the numbers that other people wrote, so I had to create my own. That's when I started experimenting with spreadsheets, rows and columns. Oh, they'd give me such a rush. VLOOKUP tables, oh, possessed me for hours. Everything was adding up so accurately. I had to share the high, so I wrote a book. I blame the sporting news for being so greedy, that they would take money from a burgeoning addict to promote my projective propaganda. Did they have no clue what they were fostering? Did they have no conscience? I gave up a month of coffee to afford the printing of 100 copies of that first book, and that wasn't easy. 67 people sent me personal checks. People afflicted by the same disorder, I guess. But it didn't stop there. It wasn't enough. I started a monthly newsletter the next spring, and every year more and more and more people would sign up for the sacrilege I was selling. But feeding a cult in a new cottage industry was no mean feat. The financial barriers were steep. I needed quick cash for print advertising and direct mail. I had to moonlight as a 9-to-5 corporate wonk just to stay afloat. I had a budget for expensive distribution channels like the United States Postal Service and the newly divested Bell system. I had to rely on inconsistent deliverability, which meant dealing with constant phone messages that often started with, "Hey Chandler, you asshole! It's draft day! Where the hell is my book?" The rotisserie baseball information industry was a cruel place back then. As a 30-something, newly datified drone, I had to work hard to avoid being lured into the dark underbelly of baseball writing. Competition was brutal. There were aspiring plagiarists who repackaged and resold my work in dark alleys for a quick buck. There were ego-driven analysts with sycophantic minions and flame war provocateurs disguised as innocent bystanders. And there were deep-pocketed opportunists with single-digit IQs who simply bought their own market share. Everything around me kept feeding the disease. USA Today, my daily salvation, started publishing Baseball Weekly to feed me more. Columnist John Hunt started the labor leagues to feed me even more. Oh, and then Al Gore invented the Internet to feed me beyond any possible recovery. At my lowest point, I was running 2 websites, coordinating 2 national experts competitions, publishing 5 books, and running a conference series that reached 15 cities from sea to shining sea. But that wasn't what broke me. I didn't finally surrender until people started vilifying me with that awful, degrading insult. You know the one. That humiliating, blasphemous put-down reserved for society's most reviled bottom feeders. They called me a fantasy expert. What a horrible thing to call someone. Fantasy? Really? This was no fantasy. This was very, very real. The work, the effort, even the game itself was a fully legitimate analytical pursuit. To smear it as a fantasy was just unconscionably cruel. And then calling me an expert? To tack a noun of pure irony onto fantasy made me sound like the king of the unicorns. I never asked for this. I was just trying to pay the mortgage and feed my family by doing something I was compelled to do. This was no fantasy. I was no expert. Enough. That's when my family insisted I get help. The good doctor, let's call him Bruce, says that the rehabilitation process starts with telling my story. The world needs to hear my cautionary tale. Bruce says that's the only way to reclaim my life. So, here we are. The $260 elephant in the room. I should probably start by telling you about the source of the affliction. I suspect that probably 87.4% of you already know about it. Perhaps you have even experienced it yourself. But I should use a few words to describe this alleged fantasy game, for those who wonder what all the fuss is about. Fantasy baseball. Noun. Modern English, fantasy baseball. French, Middle French, from Middle Latin. Basis, ballus. A competition wherein groups of people congregate in secret to view pull-out centerfolds of hobbits in catching gear, fielding high hard ones. Nope, that's not it. Let's try again. Fantasy baseball is a simulation of sorts, part intellectual exercise, part economic exercise, based on the running of a major league baseball team. A bunch of people pretending to be team owners get together and select a group of real baseball players based on who they think will perform the best during the upcoming season. They then track the performance statistics of those players during the season. The team owner who assembles the team with the best statistics wins. Most times money is involved. That is the 25-cent description. The $1.50 description goes into the actual rules of play, including the how of selecting players and scoring. That doesn't matter right now. There are many flavors of game formats, some more popular than others, and $260 is a common buy-in cost. It's not important to know how they landed on that number. It seems simple enough. But what is it about this game that creates a psychological dependency? After several years of therapy, I've come to understand the 5 elements of rotoholism that grab you by the innards and won't let go. Control. The game allows us to make real decisions, even if they are occurring in an alternative reality. Power feels good. Allegiance. In an era where local fandom is diluted by rapid roster turnover, the game gives us rooting interests in the baseball players as individuals, unencumbered by MLB team loyalties. Connections feel good. Gambling. Admittedly, the thrill of risk-taking is part of the game, giving us a stake in the players' performances on our teams. Money feels good. Ego. The game allows us to prove how smart we are as compared to our peers. Pride feels good. Diversion. At its core, the game is intended to be a hobby we can share with friends in a social setting. Fun feels good. Perhaps I should have been aware of the dangers when I noticed that these elements spell out the acronym CAGED. For the previous reasons, the game has its detractors. There are folks, often famous national writers, who claim that fantasy corrupts fandom. They claim that the game is evil. Glenn Waggoner gave a different perspective when he said, "The main effect of the game is it makes it harder to get a ticket for spring training. Beyond that, it makes people more intense and more knowledgeable fans. It's inconceivable to me that becoming more interested in something will take away from its appreciation. If someone gets so wrapped up in stats that they don't enjoy watching a triple unfold on the field, then they need help. They need counseling. Baseball is about playing the game, not about playing the numbers." I know that. You know that. But were the detractors right? Is the game evil? There must have been something to drive me to the dark side. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. There's a bigger story to tell, and I don't want to give away the surprise ending. Is there really a surprise ending? Maybe. This was a big book to write. Maybe the surprise is that I finished writing it. So, what is in this book? At its core, this book is a history, a retelling of the early days of rotisserie baseball, specifically focusing on the people whose writings helped to grow the industry and lure me into the abyss. From Alex Patton to John Benson to the members of the National Experts Leagues, these were the propagandists who made unsuspecting readers believe it was possible to predict how baseball players would perform each year. Sadly, I became part of that cult. But history has limitations. Records can be spotty, and interviewees often have lousy memories. So I've also relied on artifacts from my files, my own published articles, and personal recollections. For that reason, this is probably more of a historical memoir. Some chapters are more autobiographical than others, but the broader story is the history as told through my warped personal lens. I wanted this book to be exhaustive, but I realized that fixation was just feeding the beast. As such, this does not include every expert, wannabe expert, or faux expert who put up a shingle during the formative years of this industry. This is mainly about the people who crossed my path and left an impression. And even then I didn't include everyone. There were just too many. But if you considered yourself a player in the fantasy baseball industry and don't see your name in the book, it's not because I don't like you. Maybe I like you too much to subject you to this treatment. Finally, here is a list of source materials I used to help create this book. The Bill James Baseball Abstract, Various Years, by Bill James. Rotisserie League Baseball, Various Years, by Glenn Wagoner. Patton's Fantasy Baseball Price Guide, Various Years, by Alex Patton. How to Win at Rotisserie Baseball, Various Years, by Peter Golenbach. How Bill James Changed Our View of Baseball, by ACTA Sports. Moneyball, by Michael Lewis. Fantasyland, by Sam Walker. Fantasy Baseball, Sports, Magazine, Various Years. USA Today Baseball Weekly, various Leviathan issues. ESPN 30 for 30, Silly Little Game, Film and Outtakes. Trading the Gator, Film and Outtakes. Emil Kadlec's Fantasy Sports Pioneers, interview series on FantasyNation.com. FSWA and FSTA Hall of Fame applications. Interviews with Greg Ambrosius, Bruce Bushell, Tom Cecere, Jason Gray, Peter Kreutzer, Alex Patton, Pat Quinn, Rick Wilton, and Todd Zola. Wikipedia. Caveat emptor, I know. Newspaper and magazine clippings I've saved over the years. My own writings in the Baseball Forecaster, BaseballHQ.com, and elsewhere. All public writings appear in sans serif font. Folders on my computer, emails on my computer, randomly recalled brain flakes. Some of these ended up on the cutting room floor, but all are worth mentioning. My thanks to all these people, places, and things for helping me retell the tale and attempt to reclaim my life. That's it. Let's go. Bring along some safety goggles. Chapter 1. Backstory. This is a purely autobiographical chapter, so you can skip it if you have no interest in the first 27 years of my life. Some people like to know the person behind the pen, figuring that the backstory informs the front story. But I understand if you want to jump ahead to the good stuff. I won't be insulted. Truth is, my backstory was complex and gargantuan, and will likely require me to write a separate personal memoir. So I'll try to keep this chapter as brief as possible and focus only on the most relevant stuff. Okay. In the beginning, I was born. This was not a terribly momentous event. I suspect many humans were born in Flushing Hospital on that cold Tuesday morning in December. There was, however, a prescient birthday doppelganger. 3,000 miles away on the left coast on that very day was the birth of one Robert Michael Ojeda. He would grow up to be a notable left-handed pitcher for the New York Mets. I would grow up to be a notable right-handed fan of the New York Mets. He would play in a World Series. I would watch the same World Series. We would forever be connected in a way that no two strangers would ever again be connected. I grew up in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a 6-story building in Queens. My parents were the perfect storm of dysfunction. My father was a pessimistic narcissist, and my mother was an optimistic fatalist, which made for an existence that was constantly pulled in opposing directions of chaos and care. My father taught me to lie and deny, to keep secrets and grudges, and how gaming the system was the only way to get ahead in life. My mother taught me to be loyal and honest, and to have silent strength and shoulders of steel. One might imagine that type of parentage could have created an evil mastermind, intent on taking over the world. Instead, all it created was a Xanax addiction. But I don't want to sugarcoat this. I shared a bedroom with my younger sister and younger brother, Debbie and Marty. Both were born with familial dysautonomia, FD, a rare genetic disorder that attacks the nerves controlling blood pressure, body temperature, digestion, and breathing. Back in the 1960s, there were no foundations or telethons for FD, which was shared by only a few hundred children worldwide. Both of my siblings demanded a lot of attention, which came mostly from my mother. I had no sports role models. My father was a casual Yankees fan, but he never took me to a ball game. I guess it wasn't surprising that I had no early interest in sports. Still, he signed me up for Little League when I was 8, because that's what fathers are supposed to do. We owned no equipment, so one of my cousins bequeathed me a fossilized mitt that was dead weight in my tiny hands. It was just as well. I had no athletic skill anyway. That summer I attended my first major league ball game. It was at Yankee Stadium, and the home team lost, which was not unusual in the mid-1960s. There might have been some home runs, but there were definitely some really good hot dogs. I think the score was 4-3. I was a straight-A student, excelling in math and English, and was a fanatical writer. Going to school only a few miles from Shea Stadium, all my classmates were Mets fans, and I got caught up in the excitement of the home team's surprising run in 1969. On the afternoon of October 16th, my English teacher, Mrs. Kaplan, had the class move our desks into a circle around a small transistor radio. We all listened as Cleon Jones caught a fly ball off the bat of Davy Johnson, and the Mets won the World Series. Pandemonium erupted. The following spring I started watching games on TV more regularly, but I was fascinated by something other than the play on the field. Those numbers at the bottom of the screen. Home runs, RBIs, and batting averages were things a numbers geek could connect to. I started collecting baseball cards and learned to calculate batting averages in my head. 4 for 13, 308. 5 for 24, 208. 10 for 36, 278. Even as I just typed them, I didn't have to pull out my calculator. Crisis. Marty and I discovered Kadako All-Star Baseball, the board game with spinners and circular discs for each baseball player. Playing those games provided us a safe space in a toxic household, but a pair of family tragedies destroyed any security we thought we had. On the night of my bar mitzvah, my grandfather died. 6 months later, while my father was at synagogue saying the mourner's Kaddish for his father, my 10-year-old sister died in her sleep. Even now it is tough for me to type that line. It was a gut punch that tore a hole in the family. Debbie had struggled on and off with her disability, but there was no warning. My parents disintegrated and shipped Marty and me off to relatives. I never understood religion, but from then on, I pretty much rejected any idea of a benevolent higher power. 10 months after Debbie died, Robin was born. After being rejected by multiple adoption agencies, my father found a pregnant teen in Brooklyn and arranged a private transaction through a lawyer who allegedly dealt in black market adoptions. He swore us all to secrecy and began parading the newborn as our own. I'd never see Robin as anything other than my sister, but at 14, my worldview was pretty fucked up. While my parents were preoccupied with our new addition, I was left to my own devices. I went through a shoplifting phase, though it netted me some cool baseball books. I found that digest-sized paperbacks such as Xander Hollander's The Complete Handbook of Baseball were perfect fits in the huge pockets of my winter parka. My grades tanked, so I became totally proficient in compressing an entire unit's worth of notes into a single index card. I felt no remorse for cheating on tests. I rationalized that the effort that I was saving justified any outcome. I could say that it wasn't my proudest time, and it lasted years, but I never got caught, so I never gave it a second thought. It was simply about achieving the greatest results with the least effort. Baseball was one of my salvations. Kadako gave way to APBA. During the summers, a bunch of us would walk 3 miles to Shea Stadium, grab nosebleed seats for $1.30, and sneak down to the boxes by the 3rd inning. Other days I'd play pickup softball at Casino Park. My weak bat was relegated to the bottom of the lineup, but at least I was playing. As for fielding, well, they say I handled my glove with the grace of Kurt Blefrey. Becoming a writer. My family moved to Long Island after I graduated, and my college career began at age 16 as a math major at the State University of New York at Farmingdale. In the spring semester of my freshman year, I joined the school.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?